any U.S. politician should be able to go anywhere they are welcome and invited, including Nancy Pelosi. So if President Xi Jinping really push the whole thing to that limits, I think that's gonna look themselves look very bad. Okay, instead of United States look very bad or Taiwan look very bad, because we are not the one who rock the boats.
And if you're Xi Jinping coming in and you want to get your third stint being the grand poobah of China, then you really have to think about stability and projecting stability and having a thick skin and not, screaming your head off when Nancy Pelosi comes to visit. I've lived here for 22 years. I don't want my neighborhood, attacked or bombed or hurt or anything like that. And likewise, I also don't want to see, any other kind of disruptions.
Welcome to TaiwanPlus Point. I'm Catherine Liu.
I'm Rath.
There's been talks about U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan, and today we will discuss what's behind the heated debate and also the strong reaction around this news. I'm very glad to introduce two guests on the show today. First, I want to introduce Professor Albertchiu, who is a specialist in Taiwan-U.S Relations in Tunghai University, and also Attorney John Eastwood, Taiwan Chair of Democrats Abroad, which is the overseas arm for the U.S Democratic Party. My first question goes to Professor. What is the implication of Nancy Pelosi's meeting? She might be the first in 25 years. What's the significance of her visit?
Okay, Nancy Pelosi herself is a fighter for democracy. Actually, she constantly criticized Chinese government's handling of the human rights issues in Hong Kong and also in Xinjiang. And in fact, 3 decades ago, she even personally went to Tiananmen Square to protest the Chinese government for its crackdown on the protesters in the Tiananmen Square massacre. So I think her visit to Taiwan is not only symbolic, but could be very substantive in the future, that maybe there are further development for government in Taiwan and also Nancy Pelosi, or maybe a congressperson from the United States, to kind of work together to improve the human rights issue in the world, and of course, including China.
Timing-wise, do you think, I just want to ask, why do you think she chose right now to come here?
Well, I think that it's still very speculative whether or not she will
It has not been confirmed.
Right. Has not been confirmed. But the issue is that even the news, floating around, makes it very great for Taiwan to, first of all, become international visible. And second, is such that, it's a good chance, serve as a good chance for us to observe what Chinese government gonna respond to this possibility. Okay, so if, say, Xi Jinping, he will push the tension to an extent, and that, what might be the response from the United States government. Because, after all, since President Trump, now the dynamic between the United States and China has been different. They are in a very rocky relations. So it's, to me, sort of like experiments for us to see what's gonna happen the next.
And speaking of how it's been different with, as you mentioned, President Trump, and you mentioned how Nancy Pelosi's been a freedom fighter, do you think Beijing is wary because of the current political tensions between the two countries, or is it because of her position or her past activities in being anti-China in the eyes of China?
I think it's both. First of all, I think Nancy Pelosi herself really helped with a lot of bills be passed in the House. And those bills are more or less anti-China. And second is that, we people study American politics, we pretty understand that Democratic Party, typically they are concerned with domestic issue rather than international affairs. But time has changed and situation is different. So say President Biden, he gave up on the occupation in Afghanistan and withdrew the troops from Afghanistan. That really leads to a lot of criticism from the American society.
Is that a shift to?
It does shift, right. So from that perspective, I don't see that either Nancy Pelosi or President Biden could be overly soft on this issue regarding her visit to Taiwan, because that's not gonna do them any good in the future, especially when the midterm election is around the corner.
John, China has already raised strong and loud objections. So in your observation and opinion, how does this going to affect, well, not confirmed yet, but how is it going to affect China-Taiwan-U.S. relations?
I think one of the most important things is that an American politician like Nancy Pelosi, or Joe Biden, or even with Trump with the phone call that he had, before he was president, with the Taiwan president Tsaiingwen,
and tweet about it.
Yes, and I think there's a freedom that U.S. politicians and even Chinese politicians have to be able to go anywhere in the world that they want to go and to go talk to anyone in the world they want to go, even if they agree or don't agree with their individual positions. The idea that, for example, at the time that Trump was talking to President Tsai, you had that the biggest enemy for America at that time would have been maybe the head of ISIS, or perhaps over in North Korea, the idea of going to talk to President Kim over there. So the idea that China would not expect to be limited in any way in the people that Xi Jinping or any other Chinese official speaks with. And in the same way, the United States, I can't imagine, would want to have its people have to pre-vet every single one of their overseas travels. And honestly, you think about with the legislature, Nancy Pelosi is the head of the legislative, one of the legislative houses in the United States. And that is not exactly setting, it's very influential for foreign policy, obviously, but it doesn't actually make the final decision on it. That goes to the executive branch. So she, like any other congresswoman, any other leader, should have the ability to travel anywhere she wants, to be able to talk with whomever she wants, to understand and to be able to reflect that knowledge in her dealings on behalf of her constituents and on behalf of the U.S. people.
Now that we have the Taiwan Travel Act and all these other acts that are seen as like pro-Taiwan or friendly to Taiwan, do you think this is one of the main reasons why Beijing is objecting to this, because they see the actual execution in accordance to new legislation, or is it because of Nancy's own, advocacy in terms of being pro-Taiwan or more a bit hostile to Chinese human rights issues?
I think it's maybe her position. I mean, she's number three. Like, you have the president. You have next in chain is the vice president. You have Nancy Pelosi. She's the aside from the fact that she's the single most powerful and influential woman in legislative politics in American history, but you also have this part where just as a force of nature, she is a very powerful person. She's twice now. She's on her second time being Speaker of the House. She faced no significant challenges to that every time that she's come up, every time that the Democrats have the majority. And the truth is that people understand how effective she is. She is incredibly, people get obsessed with her because she is that effective.
So you don't think it's a ploy of China trying to test U.S. and, red lines in terms of how far, the U.S. would go? Or do you think it's because of her particular position?
There's a bit of that. I mean, in fact, there's like an internet meme around the concept of in a move sure to anger China, and then they just put in some mundane thing like, the weather is, sunny, or in a move sure to anger China, the weather is rainy. But from that standpoint, I mean, you have to think through. The United States always has to think through. Are what we're doing right now, is it going to inure to the benefit of the American people? Is it going to be good for for stability, global stability? Is it going to be good for regional stability? Is it going to be good for our other alliances? And there's also, to some extent, you have to think through whether you're going to Ferberize a bit. Do you have to listen to every single caterwauling scream of objection to, oh, you can't possibly do this, oh no, this is the most horrible thing I've ever seen? You have to balance it out, and the United States has priorities, and sometimes those priorities align with China's. I mean, climate change would be one of those. There's international trafficking, or even just, to some extent, trade. No matter the perception of adversarial on the military side or in the partnership side and who we trade with and things like that. The truth is that there's still an awful lot of trade that goes between these places, just as Taiwan has a lot of trade with China, with mainland China.
Because there's been talked about China might set up a non-navigation zone over Taiwan. And don't you think that the news itself will escalate the situation right now? Is it a sign of something deeper and broader?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's a number of ways that President Xi Jinping can do to Taiwan and indirectly to the United States. First of all, let me mention the part of the United States first. They can mobilize Chinese voters in Nancy Pelosi's district in California to do some sort of like filibuster or kind of protest in her constituency. That's number one. Number two is that the Chinese government, especially foreign ministry, the department can issue diplomatic protest. Okay, that could be another approach. For Taiwan, though, like what you just mentioned, the non-war zone, non-navigation zone, that remind me of the situation in the Ukrainian war, right? Because that's like the zone where no international flights can get in and as a way to blockade Taiwanese trade with the foreign powers. But I don't think that's gonna make any sense because, first of all, Taiwan and the United States, we have a lot of trade exchange. Basically we are like one of the major trade partners with each other. That's number one. Number two, Japan and even South Korea, right? So we got a lot of exchange of trade between Taiwan and those countries. So how are they gonna do that? Are they gonna assign Navy to kind of blockade Taiwan in the Taiwan Straits or anything like that? I don't think that's very likely. And the second is that just like what John just mentioned, any U.S. politician should be able to go anywhere they are welcome and invited, including Nancy Pelosi. So if President Xi Jinping really push the whole thing to that limits, I think that's gonna look themselves look very bad. Okay, instead of United States look very bad or Taiwan look very bad, because we are not the one who rock the boats.
What is the worst scenario that could happen here?
Well, I think China has learned a lesson from the Ukrainian war. They know that any kind of confrontation leads up to a larger scale war is not gonna do them any good, especially when President Xi Jinping, he's gonna hold the 20th Congress where he hopes to be elected over again for life, right? So that's gonna be a dynasty for him. So the first priority for him now is to make sure that everything is stable, everything is on the track, right? So I don't think that if there's a tension that develops or escalates to that point that where we will see a outbreak of a war, I don't see that's very likely.
Albert, I think you mentioned a great point in terms of stability, how Xi Jinping wants to get reelected to his third term. But there's also been voices that with that, he would want to show a strong force that he's still in charge, in power, that China's in power, dominating the region. Right. So in light of that, would he send troops or have some kind of military action in the Taiwan Strait? And if that happens, do you think the U.S. would send the 7th Fleet or have some sort of similar military maneuver that President Clinton did in '96? Yeah,
it's more like a muscle show, right? You show your muscle as a sign of your capability, and I do that too, right? So there's a balance out there, but both superpowers, I would say that one superpower, the other one is regional power, China. The superpower will be the United States. They know, the extent to which they can do that. They can showcase their military capability, but not over the border, because that's not gonna do, like what I just said, not any good to China. And not to mention that President Biden, he has a different trajectory, different from the President Trump, that he would like to use kind of simultaneously soft and hard kind of approach to deal with President Xi Jinping. So that's kind of as a sign that the Biden administration wants to deal with the whole thing, simultaneously on the one hand with the stick, on the other hand with the carrots. So that's basically my frame or my understanding of the whole Biden's administration in terms of dealing with China.
So as Catherine just mentioned, it would be worst case scenario would be just a show of force, probably one or two boats or airplanes flying over each other, but not breaking into a full-scale attack or into like
No, I don't think
actual
that's very
conflict.
likely.
What do you think, John?
Well, I mean, there's a huge risk to it, and we can see this with Russia. Russia right now goes into the Ukraine, and they were going to they were going to take the whole country over in 2 days, and then they now are like, we're 5 months in on just a slugfest in which the weakness and the lack of capability and the command structure of the Russian forces are time and time again just rubbed in the faces of every Russian and everybody in the world out there to see just how weak and impotent and pathetic they are. And then, who wants to take that risk? I mean, Lord knows, as an American citizen, I've seen my country go through that. I saw us go through like 20 years in Afghanistan and then we had to turn over the keys to that to to the new owners, they turn it over to the Taliban. I mean, man, how embarrassing that is. But even on a limited conflict scale, the prospect of having these guys, go out there and they say they try to do a limited war or a limited conflict, and then what happens if they lose? I mean, just even the risk of that is insane. It just like it could make them, and that's a big thing. It could make them look bad, could trigger sanctions, could trigger like an entire region to be extremely wary of any dealings with them. And as it is, you already have the Philippines and you have Japan dealing with this kind of, the Philippines with South China Seas, you have the Diaoyutai up with Japan, and you have this wariness that they've been unnecessarily building. And if they go and they do something with Taiwan, well, how does that make sense?
So can I understand this, that the intention might be good, but it might bring negative consequences to Taiwan and to the States? Am I understand this right?
Well, but with China, there's a huge risk. Anytime that, a force, you have like, you think about physics, potential energy. If you don't use it, it's always potential. It's always there. It could be used. But the moment you commit military force into something, you might lose it. And if you don't lose it, just even having sunk it in, sometimes it's really hard to pull back, and it's really hard to stop things from getting much worse. It's an unpredictable thing. And if you're Xi Jinping coming in and you want to get your third stint being the grand poobah of China, then you really have to think about stability and projecting stability and having a thick skin and not, screaming your head off when Nancy Pelosi comes to visit.
But the reason that they're screaming their heads off, you think is a test, or do you think, like I mentioned, like I asked before, or is it because of her position, or
it could
given
be,
the timing, or you think it's a combination?
I think it's a combination. I think it's a combination that Pelosi, like other senators have come to Taiwan, other congresspersons
You've seen
have
Tammy
come.
Duckworth come.
Yes,
and other people.
and I thought they would have noticed, they would have made note of the fact that like some of these people have visited on U.S. military planes. I mean, that's a new thing. Having these big planes show up with U.S. Air Force and, with U.S. United States of America livery on the outside of them. But like, what are they going to do? Are they going to shoot down all the passenger planes? I mean, Russia's already tried that. I mean, none of this is good. So, from the grand scheme of things, I would imagine that this is a balloon they float out. They say, oh, we will be tremendously embarrassed and troubled if, and there will be big repercussions, and you'll be fully responsible for all of those if we blow a gasket and do something crazy, which is not a recipe for stability. So they can't actually act on that. They can say it, but like going and actually trying to tear apart, the existing cross-strait peace is it's a step too far. It's too much for one visit by a senior elected congressperson who happens to have been chosen by her colleagues to be the Speaker of the House.
And I think this is a question for both of you. You've mentioned Russia quite a bit, and with Ukraine and all that. And so how much would you say Russia has influenced China's decision of thinking twice before invading Taiwan or acting out, as Catherine says?
I think it's a big deal because they've got to be looking at that and realizing the ways in which Russia, a great oil nation, couldn't even gas up their tanks and trucks when they went into a country that they share a border with. But, Taiwan, there's like a 90-mile gap of open ocean before, getting over here. And the preparations for some sort of grand armada, some sort of big D-Day fleet, that's not easy. You would spot that months before it really is ready even to go. And even the transport situation for the Chinese military isn't famously ready. So I would say there's an awful lot of things. I mean, they're just now experimenting with having their first aircraft carriers, but there's a whole art to even knowing how to protect those things. It's not, I mean, there's a lot of these things that launching forward with some sort of military action, you have to rethink it all, given what's happening to Russia right now. And likewise, the United States is definitely looking at what's happening with Russia. I mean, I think a lot of the assumptions that the Western countries, the NATO countries had about Russia I think everyone's a bit surprised by how badly the Russians are doing. And from the Taiwan side, there's an extremely important thing, which is if we look back at American history over the last 50, 60 years of what America has done. If you look at Vietnam, you look at Iraq, you look at Afghanistan, every single place where the U.S. Gets somehow involved either as a supporting nation or as an active combatant or anything like that, the willingness of the voters back home, if you take your stereotypical American voter, the average Joe, the normal person in the Midwest or anywhere.
Lost interest in this kind of thing,
They lose
right?
interest if the people who are fighting the war, whose country it involves, whose territory it is, whose homes are there, if those people throw down their rifles, they're going to be like, wow, why do my children have to die when you're not even willing to fight anymore? And that is a big deal for them. But you look at what's happening with Ukraine. Ukraine, like everybody's fighting. And I know lawyers from law firms that people in my LinkedIn feed, people I've met at law conferences, and they're sending pictures saying, like, yeah, I went and I filed a few trademarks from this roadblock I'm manning right now with my rifle. And some of these people, I'm talking about work from home, that's, it's pretty extreme.
Go out their way to defend their country.
There are entire law firms of people I know in Ukraine where they've all put down their computers, vacated their offices, and everyone, their staff and their attorneys and their paralegals and everybody else have now picked up rifles to go to the front. And that kind of a notion, that kind of idea that you're not just up against an army of 100,000 or 200,000, but you're up against, 23, 24 million, people. I mean, Ukraine, they really have, what they've done is absolutely incredible in fighting back as a nation, as a unified nation, saying our democracy was worth it.
I think that's very inspiring, and hearing that story, how Ukrainians are fighting for that. And do you think Taiwan should learn from that, or?
Yeah, what's the takeaway here, Professor?
Well, in
this story,
I think John made a great point. Is that it's all about ourselves. Regardless how much the United States is willing to help us, it's about mentality. It's about our preparation. It's about our day-to-day exercise. Just among the ordinary citizens in Taipei, in the city of Taipei, in the city of Taichung, and so on. Okay, one thing I do want to emphasize is that if President Xi Jinping dared to take any solid military measure against Taiwan, should Nancy Pelosi come visit, I think he better make it. President Xi Jinping has to make it successful.
In what sense?
Make it successful. Make it in the sense of successfully conquering Taiwan, or otherwise, his regime will be totally fail, and he will be gonna kick out by the Chinese people, and his family will be in danger. Okay, so that's gonna be a great risk, like what John just mentioned. That's number one. Number two, I think that just to answer your question, what kind of lesson did Chinese government learn from the Ukrainian war? I think it's tremendous. It's tremendous because first of all, the whole Ukrainian war is such an experiment where Chinese government really observed what United States government can do to help Ukrainian government. Even though a lot of people criticize Biden administration by saying that you guys did not go far enough and did not provide enough assistance, but actually to me, it's very interesting because what President Biden did was just enough for Ukrainian to successfully resist Russia and to make Russia, sacrifice a lot of soldiers, a lot of generals, and even the Musk, the founder of the car company, right? He provides a lot of intelligence for Ukrainian soldiers. They can shoot down the airplane and very successfully, just simply from. Right, model space, right? Yeah. So that's all showcase for the Chinese government to see that how much the United States can do, even though not military intervene in the battlefield, but simply the indirect assistance would be enough for Ukraine to survive. And of course, I don't say that this is how much that the United States could do to Taiwan if there's a war between China and Taiwan. But that really gives a very important implication. Just like what you just mentioned, China is not militarily prepared enough to attack Taiwan. If it does, that's the end. That's the doomsday for China, for Xi Jinping himself.
Yeah, I want to circle back to the potential visit a little bit. If and when she does visit Taiwan, we talked about it a little bit. Is it on the congressional level?
President Tsai will meet her for sure, even though that's gonna be a big provocation to President Xi Jinping. But I think she would do that because after all, she come here. Nancy Pelosi come over Taiwan as a guest, right? And the landlord or the master of the country is President Tsaiingwen. Of course, she really has to take that chance to meet up with her. That's number one. Number two, I think Nancy Pelosi will meet up with a lot of congresspersons in our legislative yuan. That's very natural development. I can foresee that. And the other thing I would like to add up is that even though President Biden said that the military, the Pentagon, advised against her visit to Taiwan for safety reason, and even Nancy Pelosi herself said that I cannot tell any more information about my visit because it's about my safety. But you will see that the United States is such a country abide by the separation of powers. You have the executive, the legislature, and judiciary. They don't belong to each other. Actually, they supervise each other. So even though Biden said that this is not a good idea for you to visit Taiwan, Nancy Pelosi can just let it alone. Just go ahead and do whatever she thinks is proper to do. Okay. So, but on the other hand, also they belong to the same party, Democrats, right? And the midterm election is around the corner. So I think from some sort of communication channel, they will talk to each other to evaluate the effect of her visit to Taiwan. So it's hard for me to speculate whether or not she will make it to Taiwan at the end of the day. But what I can say is that the more President Xi Jinping and also the CCP put pressure on Taiwan, and especially on the United States, the more likely we'll see her visit to Taiwan will come true.
Thanks, Professor. This question is more for John, but since you've been here a very long time and you've worked with the Democratic leadership extensively, if she actually comes, what kind of substantial effects do you think we'll see in terms of Taiwan or in terms of the trilateral U.S. Taiwan-China relationship?
I think one of the first things that we see. Now as was acknowledged earlier, is Nancy Pelosi is a huge supporter of democracy, self-determination, and the protection of democratic nations and democratic norms, and the American partnerships, the promotion of normalcy in our relationships around the world. And so she is an extremely powerful voice on all of these fronts. For her to come to Taiwan and see firsthand, to meet the people, to be able to gauge the sincerity of the leadership within Taiwan, and that's also across all spectrums. She can meet with President Tsai, but also to meet with the legislative yuan, to meet with people of both parties there as well, to see the determination. I have, having lived here for 22 years, I've got huge respect for the democracy that Taiwan has. There was, in the course of 40 years of martial law, the sacrifices that were done by, say, our parents' or grandparents' generation what they went through, the losses, the tens of thousands of people who were lost in the struggle for democracy. So, from a standpoint, the ability to gauge and to be able to understand, where the people of Taiwan are and where their leadership is at is so important. It's part of the information collection process that a lot of our congresspersons and our senators go through in their international travels, is to go and to meet and to see people and to look in their eyes and sense who they are dealing with. And this is so important. And so a leader of her level to be able to do that and not just be on a Zoom call or something like that, but just to have a couple of hours here and there and to have in-depth conversations, I think is essential.
Speaking of Taiwan-U.S China relations, I spoke earlier with Wang Dan, the leader of the Tiananmen Democracy Movement that was brutally crushed by the Chinese Communist Party. Wang has lived in all three countries and has worked extensively with the House Speaker since moving to the U.S. in exile. Let's take a look at what Wang Dan has to say from his personal interactions with the House Speaker, as well as what her visit means to the region.
Wang Dan, what does news of a potential House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi visit to Taiwan imply for current U.S. China relations?
I think Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, despite China's protest, would mean a fundamental shakeup of U.S. China relations, which has been the foundation of U.S. China relations since the day diplomatic relations were established. So this is why Chinese government side reacted so strongly.
As a longtime Chinese democracy activist based in the U.S., can you describe Nancy Pelosi's advocacy for advocating and preserving democracy and human rights in China and also Hong Kong and Taiwan?
Well, I know Nancy for a long time. Nancy Pelosi has long been one of the strongest supporters of human rights and democracy in China in U.S. Congress. The U.S. House of Representatives, under her leadership, has passed a lot of and a record number of bills on China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong issues. I think her support for us comes from her heart, and it's not merely a matter of diplomatic strategy. So this is what set her apart from most other American politicians.
Should a Nancy Pelosi Taiwan visit happen, what future impact do you expect it to have on U.S. policy towards Taiwan and also China in particular?
I think her visit to Taiwan has more symbolic meaning. There's already a bipartisan agreement on U.S. support for Taiwan already in Congress. And even if she's unable to visit this time, it will not affect continued U.S. support for Taiwan. Likewise, even if she succeeded in her visit to Taiwan, it does not mean that the United States will make substantial adjustment to its Taiwan policy. The U.S. executive branch will be more cautious in its decision than the legislative branch.
What role does the U.S. Congress have, as you mentioned, that it's distinct from the executive branch in deterring China from further aggression towards Taiwan and further crackdown on human rights in China?
Well, generally speaking, the U.S. Congress can pass legislation to put pressure on the government to adjust the U.S. policies. So if such legislation is passed overwhelmingly, the White House must have to respond. So therefore, it's very important to promote the introduction of bills by U.S. legislators and to push the passage of such bills. That'll be very helpful, both for human rights record of China and for Taiwan.
The footage you just watched is from Wang Dan, and you can see how he is moved by Nancy Pelosi's dedication. Albert, as far as I know, Wang Dan is being very active still here in Taiwan. So there's no shocking that he will have strong feeling toward this event, right?
Well, I'm not surprised that Wang Dan would go out and support Taiwan in this way. I think that he now is in the United States, but he was living in Taiwan for a while. And like what John just mentioned, that he experienced how democracy has been very consolidated in Taiwan and how much we struggle to get to that point. Okay, but the thing is that I think any kind of U.S. officials not to mention high level like Nancy Pelosi, if they come over Taiwan, other than we just talk about the consensus we have with the United States in terms of democracy and human rights and so on, I think that's not enough. What I argue is that whenever there's a high-profile U.S. Diplomats or public officials come over Taiwan, we should co-sign documents, regardless it's only symbolic or even substantive, with the United States regarding Taiwan's autonomy and also how much we support democracy. So we really can do something, and we put down those dreams in words. Because politicians comes and go. Maybe they only have 4-year term limits, but when they leave, what's left there is the written documents. So that is what I'm saying, that when Donald Trump was in the ruling position, the really accomplishment for Taiwan is that we all together push through, we implement a lot of action that successfully translates ideas into bills and eventually become law. Like the Taiwan Relations Act is such a good example that protect Taiwan for several decades, even after the United States broke the diplomatic relationship with Taiwan in 1979.
So how do you see that in terms of, Nancy's, as you mentioned, she's a supporter of democracy, and she mentioned a few days ago that Taiwan's independence, it's up for the Taiwanese people to decide, not for anyone else, which putting that on the people of Taiwan, I think is a significant move. How would you say we leverage that in terms of being in Taiwan and what we can influence in terms of U.S. policy?
Right. Well, actually, I think the era since 2016 has been drastically different in one dimension. That is, we kind of fall back on the sovereignty itself. I mean, the sovereignty not only of the superpower, but the sovereignty of small states like Taiwan, right? And what I mean is that we really have to listen to people, the locals residing in that states, what our willingness is, what our hope is. So when saying that, I'm simply just saying that the willingness of us as a people in this land is very important. It's important not only regarding to decide what kind of lifestyle we're gonna have, democracy, authoritarianism, but also what's the future for us. Okay, and I think the United States government now realize this, compared with, say, Obama administration back to when, or even George W. Bush's administration, that they really care more about the international relations, the struggle in the international community more so than the willingness or the voice of the local people. And now we know that we have a chance to speak out, to speak up for our own rights in Taiwan. And I think in relative sense that the United States have more room to digest this kind of request from Taiwan. Even though we are not U.S. citizens, we don't have voting rights in the United States, but our voice does matter to when it comes to the consideration of the U.S. politicians, because they really have to be responsible for the whole world, not only the domestic American society. Even when I say that, that might be a little bit more idealistic, but I think it is not idealistic, but could be very pragmatic in the sense that if we can, like what I suggested, sign documents or kind of convene people in Taiwan or somewhere in Asia and talk about the democratic possibility of future for the whole Asia and even for the whole world. And I think in that scenario, we will have a say in it, and we can do something concrete.
Speaking of being responsible for the whole world, John, as you're the Democratic Party, you represent the leadership here in Taiwan. And there's been a perception that Republicans are more friendly towards Taiwan or towards strengthening that relationship. What do you say to that? Especially in terms of Democrats have always been pro-human rights, and I think that's been a strong area for the Democrats.
Yeah. I mean, now today I'm speaking in my own individual capacity, but from a standpoint of what I've observed from being around a lot of Democrats is that they do care profoundly about Taiwan. There's large numbers of congresspersons and senators that have had a chance to meet during their times coming out here, a lot of Democratic leaders who have come out here through DNC and ASDC visits to Taiwan. And in terms of like, where's the party, at in terms of, like, is there a competition between the two? And, I sometimes hear this. I often will hear people will say, well, Jimmy Carter changed recognition in 1979. And I'm like, well, yeah, but it was Nixon doing shots with Zhou Enlai, in '72, and Clinton sent aircraft carriers, and George W. Bush kind of ignored the region for 8 years. And so we have these presidents who have, at various points, there's Democrats that have stuck their neck out. There's Republicans that have done the right thing by Taiwan. And over time, I would say, thank goodness that Taiwan enjoys bipartisan support, because there's definitely politicians on the other side where I think probably Taiwan's the one thing that we both would agree on.
Circle back to U.S. politics. You don't have to be a political expert to realize that President Biden is under immense pressure right now. They're talking about the midterm election coming around, the high inflation. His latest approval rating down to just 36%. So I guess from an economic point of view, do you think President Biden want to mend relationship toward China?
That's interesting, because I guess there's two things there. One thing is that, striking a deal with China is not necessarily a popular thing with American voters, because, in a sense, I mean, now maybe with soybean farmers and certain other folks that have a lot of trade with China, it's a popular thing. But I think there's a reason why Trump never could get it solved once he started this aimless trade war thing that he had, that he started up without any way to get out of it. And the reason why Biden didn't front burner it, didn't make it an important thing, was because fixing the trade relationship with China is also not a key to political success in America these days. That's not to say it isn't important in the big scheme of things. That's not to say that there aren't huge areas in which the U.S. and China can interact in a very positive way. I mean, climate change is the obvious one, but you get to what's going to be, for the midterm elections, what's going to be important. And I think there's an interesting phenomenon. The analysis seems to be that in the House and in the Senate, the Democrats are not doing too badly. But you have a president who is not guided by what's popular or what is going to play to his base. Biden is trying to be president to the entire United States. Trump never did that. Most presidents try to do that. Most presidents try to at least put on a show of representing as the president, to preside over the whole country, whether they agree with them or not, that they're there for the good of the country. And Biden, I guess it's a bit refreshing to me because I'm a nerd, but for a lot of people, it's not flashy. Every morning when they would look at Twitter, the Twitter feed for Trump, they would see something crazy had just erupted. And if you were on his side, man, that was like, that was like, yeah, like having a pop rock, or having some kind of. It was just, it was a bit crazy. It was like having a bunch of candy. It was like having, having
on steroids.
Yes, steroids, and it was just like some kind of crazy thing. It was like crack cocaine for his supporters. What you have with a president that listens to experts and tries to do the right thing, you end up with it's not necessarily the popular thing. And I can see why his popularity is not shining, because he's not doing he's doing the boring work of good governance. He's just doing stable things. I mean, oh my God, after 4 years, we finally have a president who's stable.
I guess my last question for John is, speaking of the Trump administration, Mike Pompeo was here, right? He actually made it here. And now we have the news that Pelosi might be here. So you look at these two events together. What does it say?
Bipartisan support. That's the thing. Mike Pompeo, I could look at him and I would say he's a broken clock. He's correct maybe twice a day. But he's right on Taiwan. And that's one of the things that I think is glorious. There's a lot of Republicans where I'm going to disagree with almost everything they have out there, but when they look at supporting the safety, I look at my own children. My children have Taiwan passports. They also have American passports. Someday my children may be asked to, fulfill their national service obligation in one of their countries. And I've lived here for 22 years. I don't want my neighborhood, attacked or bombed or hurt or anything like that. And likewise, I also don't want to see, any other kind of disruptions. I actually just, our world is a better place when we have peace and stability and trading and technology and ideas and things moving across borders in the ways that they should.
Whether or not a Nancy Pelosi visit happens, we are sure that there is bipartisan support for Taiwan, and Taiwan is on the top agenda for both the U.S. and China.
So thank you so much, Albert and John. We understand a little bit more, from 3 different angles, right? Thank you so much for being here, and I hope we can continue to see you guys come into the show and share this insight. Thank you so much. And thank you for watching TaiwanPlus Point. I'm Catherine Liu.
I'm Rath Wang.
For more information, please download the TaiwanPlus app. I'll see you next time.